Dear participants, let me just introduce our last panel, our last moderator of the panel, Europe and the Changes in the Mediterranean, who was kind enough to join us straight from the airport. That's why we also had a bit of a change in the schedule. Mr. Edward Mortimer, who is the chief speechwriter and the director of communications with the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, and is now from the Salzburg Global Seminar. Unfortunately, one of our participants, one of our panelists, couldn't make it due to travel arrangements, but we still wish you to enjoy the last panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andre. Here we are. Sorry. We were issued with instructions about the role of the chair or the moderator, but I will try and interpret them moderately because, as you can see from my appearance, I don't really belong in a young-blood strategic forum. But I think must be in the mind of the organizers some connection between age and moderation, you know, that you young people are all supposed to be extremists, and so it's a good idea to have an older person to moderate the discussion, and I'll do my best as far as that might be necessary. Anyway, I am supposed to introduce the topic and 2 or 3 underlying themes and key issues to be discussed. And the topic, as you know, is Europe and the changes in the Mediterranean. And I would say, actually, that I see 3 or 4 themes as being important under that heading. I think probably the most important is the way that we think about each other and imagine each other on the different sides of the Mediterranean. How Europeans think of Arabs and Muslims, and how Arabs and Muslims think of Europeans or of the West. And where do we get those images from? How far are they distorted? And how can we ensure that we actually know each other as peoples and not as stereotypes? Second issue, which I think looms very large, especially in the minds of people in southern Europe, but in quite large parts of Europe, is the movement of people. The fact that there are very large numbers of newcomers, people whose origins are outside Europe, who either themselves came or their parents or grandparents came within the last 40 or 50 years to live in Europe. And that is seen by many people in Europe as a problem. I don't think it is necessarily a problem. I think in many ways it's a very great good fortune that Europe has to have attracted these people who bring talent and enterprise and cultural differences which should be something seen as enriching a society rather than threatening it. But it doesn't always work out like that in practice. Of course, that is related to the previous question about the mutual perceptions that different kinds of people have. A third issue, of course, is the economic relations between these two sides, if we are to think of them as two sides. We live very close to each other. The Mediterranean is not very wide. There are great opportunities for exchange of goods and services and investment, but maybe these have not been optimized in recent times, and we should think about how we can improve that and give, basically, I think, each side be more open to the imports of goods and capital and services from the other. And finally, I think it's a question of what do we mean by the two sides of the Mediterranean? Who are we including and who are we excluding? When we look at the southern side, we tend to speak as if it was synonymous with the Arab world. But of course, the Arab world stretches well beyond the Mediterranean, through the Fertile Crescent into Iraq, and the Arabian Peninsula. So are we talking actually about relations between Europe and the whole Arab world? Or are we really thinking more specifically of the countries that have a Mediterranean coastline? And on the northern side, we are lucky enough to have a speaker from Turkey on this panel. Turkey is a candidate member of the European Union. I fear that, at least in quite a number of Western European countries, Turkey is not seen as being a European. And when we talk about relations, between Islam and the West, we tend to think Turkey is a Muslim country, so it sort of belongs in the Middle East. It belongs, if you like, with the Arabs, rather than with the Europeans. But of course, I don't think, well, we shall hear, but my impression is that Turks themselves don't think, by and large, in that way. And so I think when we start talking about relations between the two sides of the Mediterranean, we need to think, well, on the northern side, should we not include Turkey? And might Turkey not actually be the European country that can most help us to a fruitful relationship with the people on the other side? And what about Israel? Israel is on the shores of the Mediterranean. It's on the eastern side, I suppose, but surrounded by the Arabs. There is Lebanon and Syria to the north of it, and then there is Egypt to the south of it. Maybe some Arabs still wish that it were not there and do not want to include it in any kind of Mediterranean society. But I don't think we can wish it away, and I don't think personally that we should wish it away, even though we might wish its policies to be different, particularly towards the Palestinians. But I think that we should also think, if we're going to have a Mediterranean society, how Israel can be included in that and what role it should play. And again, I think that you know something about Israel, because I see you've written a thesis, or you are writing one, about citizens.
The main thesis was about civil-military relations in Israel. And my PhD thesis, which is I currently study on, is the Turkish origins of people who moved to Germany and Israel.
So I think that might give us a particularly interesting perspective. So those are my personal thoughts about some subjects we might explore in this discussion. Now let me introduce the panelists. Immediately on my right here is Mohammed Al-Abdallah, who is from Syria. He is a former political prisoner in Syria, and I think that in itself should give us a lot of respect for him, because I don't think that's anything that any of us would want to be. And that is an experience that he's been through. And he has been involved in the revolution in Syria from its very early weeks, when the uprising started in Daraa in March of last year. And now he is in the United States, and he runs the Syria Justice and Accountability Center. Then beyond him is Aleš Gauba, who is a journalist here in Slovenia, and is specialized in the Middle East, but also in Central Asia and the Caspian. He's a former foreign editor of one of the leading Slovene newspapers, Dnevnik, and now he edits its news website. So he's moved into the great new world of digital media. And then you already heard a few words from Adam Muzaffar Erol, who is an international relations specialist at the Marmara Group Social and Strategic Research Foundation in Istanbul. He has an MA in sociology and anthropology of the Middle East, and as we just mentioned, he's now writing a PhD thesis on citizens of Turkish origin in both Israel and Germany, which I must say I think is a fascinating topic. And there is a fourth panelist who, as you just heard, because of a strike in Lufthansa, is unfortunately not able to be here in time. But he has sent me his remarks, and they're quite short, so I will perhaps read them, or some of them, a bit later. But let's first hear from the three who are here in flesh and blood. And since the changes have been happening in the Arab world, let's hear first from Muhammad, who has been at the center of some of those changes.
Thank you very much, Edward, and thanks for all of you for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to start from the points you already have raised. How the EU treated Middle East and the Arab world during the few last decades. For a long time, the EU governments did terrible and bad things, emboldening dictators in Arab worlds. And they worked with those people, despite the fact they know they're abusing their citizens, they're not legitimate governments, they're corrupted people, and they accepted the fact to work with them and to open bank accounts for them and to have great relations with them. To the limit, push the defense minister in France to offer Ben Ali in Tunisia to send the army from French or police to crack down the protesters in Tunisia. And that she had to resign after that comment when the revolution won in Tunisia. And to the level that allowed Berlusconi to host Gaddafi and bring 500 beautiful women, Italian women, to have a Gaddafi lecturing for them about everything, about God, about Quran, about Islam, about the Green Book, about everything, with no shame from Italy, from France, and from other governments. So from the political level, Europe did terrible thing, and they're still doing it. That unfortunate thing. They did not learn from the lesson, and they did not learn. I remember this great quote from Condoleezza Rice. I'm not a big fan of the lady, but she said, for decades, we emboldened dictators to gain stability, rather democracy. But we gain neither, nothing. Neither democracy nor stability. And the second thing, which is even more worse, is the selectivity that the EU governments work with the Middle East governments or country regarding the human rights records. When they criticize human rights abuses in Syria, but not in Tunisia. They criticize how Assad using power against his nation in Syria, which is a legitimate concern. But they don't look how Saudi Arabia sent their army to crack down a revolution in different country, in Bahrain, for God's sake. It's not even in their country. That's okay, because Saudi Arabia is a great resource of oil, and that's very shameful. And the second level, and that's led us to the first level as well, there's a great link here, is how the European companies work in the EU, and they respect the rights of their citizens. They do a great job. But then when they go to the Middle East, they do a terrible job. Vodafone, when Mubarak asked them to shut down the internet, they obeyed with that. But they cannot do this in EU. They would say that's illegal, and we cannot do this. And the same way the Swedish government has no shame to veto a sanction package from the EU on the telecommunication sector in Syria, only to allow Ericsson to keep working in Syria and make profit out of the Syrians' blood. They know Ericsson working in the government, and the government using their technology to identify the location of activists who's using satellite phones and bombing their houses and location, and they're working there. And I told the foreign minister, Belkard, I was there in Internet Stockholm Forum, and he was like very proud about the values and democracy. And then I grabbed my iPad. I'm like, here's your quote to Reuters yesterday. For God's sake, you're lecturing here. And he had no comment to that. And just denied, like, don't look, don't listen, ignore them. That's a bad thing. And the other thing is how the EU companies set economic relation with the Middle East based on one side benefit, not both sides. I grew up in Tunisia for 10 years. My dad used to work for the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is going to lead us. My dad worked for Yasser Arafat, and he was very close man to him as a journalist. And I remember this French jeans place, that was a great place where they made this great fancy jeans, but it's not allowed to be sold in Tunisia. It's going to be shipped back to France. And if you want to buy it, you have to go to France, or you find it in the duty-free places. Every single jeans that requests 10 barrels of water from the Tunisian. Not only use it, but you make it bad by chemical things and throw it back to the water. And the Tunisian is not benefiting from this. The style of work the EU set with the Middle East is not relying the way that China or Japan did. They train the people, and they bring them from their own country, and they open factories in their own countries in the poor areas. No. It's one-side benefits, and that's led to a very huge problem. That's led us to the social level here. The EU has no tolerant migration policy toward Arabs. I understand this. I live in the US. I've never felt I'm a stranger, because the US is the land of migrants. Like, you have lots of tolerance toward migrants. I understand US very far. It's not easy to people to go there. Only the problem with Mexico with Latin American countries. The EU is closed. People put themselves on boat from Libya or Tunisia. They end up in Italy or another country. But so far, the EU countries are not tolerant toward migrants. And this tolerance, not only in the work market, how they abuse them, how the racism rate is high against the French people who has the French citizenship, but they are originally from Algeria or from Morocco. And yet there's some Algerian people who worked for the French army during the occupation of Algeria. And then when they got back, they took them to France with them, and they did not give them citizenship. They consider them Algerians, and they're second generation and third generation. And this leads us again to the religion freedom, how Muslims live in the EU. I was in Paris and Geneva and Stockholm, Brussels. I almost went to most of Western and Middle Europe countries. I feel stranger in everything I do, and something I don't feel in the US. And if you look a little bit about the regulation and the laws the EU governments did in banning the niqab in France, and then banning the mosque towers, I don't know what they call in English, in minarets in Switzerland, all this linking us back to the clash between cultures or fear from Muslims, despite the fact all EU governments pushing for protecting minorities in Middle East. But when the Muslims are minorities in their homeland, there's a different story here. And I was reading this book, fantastic book for Indian author. It's called The Identity and Violence, how your identity affects you to violence or not. And he had telling the story when he landed in Heathrow Airport, and the migration officer looked at his passport and saying the address is the house of the dean of the economic school. And he asked him, are you a friend of him? He's hosting you. The migration officer did not even get the idea he might be the dean of the school himself because he's Indian. And the guy took a few minutes to think about it, and that's referred him to another layer of inspection because he did not get exact quick answer. And there's this great quote from the book. I end up with this quote saying, when we imagine the interaction and great relation between nations as dialogue between civilization, we're abusing every single mean of a human being, because human beings are made to make interaction and intervention with people, not because to put it in the context of nation to nation or religion to religion. I'll end up here and we'll follow the comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So next, I will ask Adam to give his view, please.
Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, it's okay right now. I would like to talk about some theoretical subjects. I hope you will not get bored, because we need to see the concepts and how we shaped and used by the people and the armies or other governments like that. Firstly, I would like to talk about democracy as a concept which is hard to define. Before coming to here, I searched about democracy not in the political science books, but just in internet, and I found 40 different versions of democracy. So we think about democracy, and before 5 years ago, George Bush went to Iraq to take democracy to Iraq, but which democracy? We saw democracy having no universal definition, but is basically built upon concept of equality and freedom. And it is day-to-day version. Democracy refers mostly liberal democracy, but liberal democracy is considered and defined with different options, different approaches. Therefore, there is neither a single democracy and nor a single variable and determinant for liberal democracy, which is mostly recalled when one mentions democracy. In this sense, maybe it would be better to argue that there are democracies, not a single democracy, and to consider it an ideal political system as it enjoys no universal definition. But I take liberal democracy as a system of materiality because Charles Tilly, one of the leading politicians, political scientists, argues that capitalist economies are more inclined to host and embrace democratic regimes. The reason for this tendency is not something about ideological match of democracy and free enterprise, but it rather lies upon material foundations of administration. When we look at the history of today's developed countries, developed democracies, we can see that the driver of development of economic capitalism is the rise of phenomenon of nation state, where the people speaking the same language within a delineated territory and sharing the same symbolic and cultural values, and where the same economic system reproducing the system of values. And what has created the functioning relationship between nation state and people living with their boundaries is the citizenship. So this entirely refers of system of material values. In other words, with the rise of nation states, people found themselves in a position to move status of citizenship, which rendered them an active player of society, enjoying rights and having capacity to change things from status of mere subjects of state apparatus where they entirely played an active role. What is more, their such rights and capacity to change the things enjoy the legal protection. All such developments change the relation of people with the divine and mythical beings embraced a lot, while relationship of non-materiality with the ruling power ceased to exist. It began to occupy a place in private love of fellow citizens. It is a kind of brief sum of which has happened in Europe. When we come to East is different concept, you know, but East, when I say East, I try to define Middle East. And to see the Islam, I think Islam can be considered as a religion which responds to material issues and of social life. And we can connect this thing with the Arab Spring, I think. When we look at the Arab Spring, until now, it seems that Islamic parties have taken over the power after the fall of dictators in Tunis, Egypt, and Libya. And it is highly likely that Syria will go in that direction as well. Emergence of Islamic rule urges us to take a sociological look at Islam. As a religion which emerged in the 7th century, Islam is relatively never religion compared to Judaism and Christianity, because Islam is a product of more advanced steps of humankind, revolution of humankind, compared with Judaism and Christianity. When we look at the holy books of these religions, while texts of holy books, Judaism and Christianity, were rich in legends and mythological aspects, but the holy book of Islam has even references to such aspects of social life as marriage, inheritance, etc. This fact enabled Islam to play more comprehensive and, for that matter, more active role in social life. And this position of Islam converted into a political awareness of system of beliefs in these failed states where democratic institutions haven't emerged. In this geography, where nationalism being one bearing pillars of phenomenon of nation state didn't flourish in an entire sense of word, so Islam merely became an expression of also a collective identity. So let's think, people without any leader and expectation at all under such circumstances eventually found themselves to rise in against the ruling systems in the aftermath of inequality driven by neoliberal policies, danger of hunger by rising food prices triggered by global economic crisis, and poverty as a whole. So finally, the mobilizer of all such uprisings has been the Islam, which is the most organized entity in this geography. I have some words also, but for what else now question can be, I think, answered with your questions, so I can finish here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now I turn to Alish, who will give us some account of the European reaction to these events, I think.
Good afternoon to everybody. Before coming to the current European policy towards the Arab Spring, please bear with me a couple of minutes to go through the last 19 months of developments there, so you better understand my point in the end. As the first Arab uprising broke out in Tunisia, the European Union was caught totally unprepared for it. It didn't understand at the beginning the grievances for freedom, social justice, respect, and the wish for a better future could just in a couple of weeks bring down a corrupt and autocratic regime. The writings were though all over the wall. You just had to read carefully the Arab Human Development Report that was prepared by the United Nations. It gave a bleak outlook of the region, especially the youth and its perspectives. A wide-reaching popular uprising was, in my opinion, just a matter of time. It may have come as a bread riot, but the most challenging process in the Arab world in the 21st century came as a massive response to the lost dignity of a single human man to a police officer. As the Arab virus for freedom, democracy, and human dignity spread to Egypt, and all those things that I mentioned are basically universal human values, the West only slowly started to realize that a huge storm is brewing in the Middle East. By West, let me define, I mean European Union and the United States. So down the drain we're going decades of good cooperation with autocratic regimes that suppressed its people, while especially Egypt, while being deemed a beacon of stability by the West, despite that non-governmental organizations such as Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch regularly reported on its massive human rights violations. As Egypt was still one of the leading nations in the Arab world, the fall of Hosni Mubarak, of course, had a galvanizing effect through the region, in large parts of the civil society also, especially in the youth. They came out in the public sphere debating about it. This feeling didn't find quite common grounds with the major players in the region. Again, decades of predictable relationships between Western governments and autocratic regimes have been put into question. The so much welcomed status quo that was a major thing for decades in this region started to crumble. The European Union and the US for a long time remained silent. But the virus spread to Libya, where the West till now the only time intervened militarily in the process of the so-called Arab Spring. Compared to the case of Syria, the hesitation was quite smaller. Libya, of course, was an easy target. It wasn't placed on the fault lines, geopolitical fault lines of the Middle East. A regime change was seemed easy, and in the end, it was. Also, in the case of Libya, the international community, for the first time, used its right to protect the civilian population, but also misused it. Why? Because the Security Council resolution hasn't envisaged a regime change, In the end, it was done by the hands of the rebels, though with a lot of air support help and other logistical help from member countries of NATO. Again, the European Union here wasn't a major player. In the case of Syria, the eagerness for military intervention was and still is, I would say, very low. The Syrians quite openly ask, are our lives less worth than the Libyans? As several geopolitical fault lines also again cross Syria, it was in no one's interest, I think, at the beginning when the uprising or demonstration started, that the Assad regime would fall. There were too many open questions on how Iran, Hezbollah, or Israel would react in this powder keg. As this question still remains open, the level of death now has exceeded the tolerable number that the West was prepared to shut its eyes from. The popular uprising also changed phase. It's changed phase from peaceful demonstrations towards armed resistance and engaging towards the Assad security apparatus and paramilitary forces. And further on, it descended into a full-scale civil war, with several players now fighting in this war, also jihadists from outside. The situation is even more complex because a proxy war is brewing between the West, and here I mean the US in particular, and Russia, as well a proxy war between the Gulf states and Iran. Again, European Union here isn't a major player. It wasn't a major player as well in the whole of the Middle East, while on the contrary, some of its member states were and still are. This goes back to special relationships established since the colonial era, or special geopolitical energy security interests of those member countries of the EU and some Arab countries. Some commentators argue that the Arab Spring turned into an Arab winter in the case of Syria. I would tend to disagree. I think the ideas of the Arab uprising are still lively as 19 months ago, but the prospects for a fast change towards democracy reversed dramatically. It was not the case of Syria, in my opinion, but the cases of Yemen and Bahrain, where the international community interfered in the flow of the revolutions. Again, it was not the European Union that was a player in these cases. In the case of Yemen, it was Saudi Arabia and the US. And in the case of Bahrain, the US, Saudi Arabia, and Great Britain. As the revolution spread to the borders of Saudi Arabia, I think the time has come that certain players started to think that uprising management is needed. The uprising in Yemen was managed so that Ali Abdullah Saleh left power, but the majority of the regime remained in place under different leadership. On the contrary, to the eastern side of Saudi Arabia and in Bahrain, the demands for a genuine overhaul of the political institutions, the political framework of the country, and the demands for the majority population, Shia population, that their rights should be respected, were brutally suppressed by the Bahraini security forces with help of Saudi Arabia's security forces, UAE's security forces, and I would say also with a quiet approval by the United States. American geopolitical reasons, American geopolitical interest in the region. After those two cases, Yemen and Bahrain were left intact. Bahrain relatively remained a stable country hosting the Fifth Fleet of the US, which is particularly important in a time when, again, the West ratchets up its rhetoric towards a possible war with Iran. And the US continued its counterterrorism operations in Felix, Arabia, in Yemen. So again, the European Union here wasn't a major player. And it was those cases that I mentioned, in my opinion, Yemen and Bahrain, where the Arab uprisings got a huge blow, and the continuation we see now in Syria is a consequence of this. In such an environment and of bad historical legacies towards the Muslim world, and a very limited scope of influence by the European Union, if any, in this region, Brussels now again, and here I come to the European policy, tries to play its part by giving larger assistance to those governments that are willing to go on a path of reform, political reform, an overhaul of security apparatus, giving assistance for free and fair elections, giving assistance for greater education and student exchange programs, as well as for financing of the NGO sector, who should keep a watchful eye on what the government does. I think it's a good way to start. It's also a good way that there's a differentiation between countries that are willing to take on a faster path than those who don't, and there isn't anymore the one approach fits all thinking in Brussels. And I think nobody can deny, actually, that investment in education and student exchange programs won't bear fruit in the long run, in the long term. But I question whether the Arab region and its generation, the Arab region has another generation that it can wait for those programs to show some impact. Or that their people's aspirations for those universal human values that I mentioned before are met. I believe Brussels still has a tremendous task in front of it. It was not possible to do it in times of fat cows. Now we're in times of lean cows and recession in the European Union. So the policymakers have to take in consideration also other things, and I wouldn't want to be in their shoes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alish. And now let me introduce the fourth panelist, who unfortunately is not here, although I think he will be later today, and I hope many of you will have a chance to meet him. This is Faris Badr, who will very shortly be celebrating his 18th birthday. So here's somebody who certainly belongs in a young forum. And he is a change maker. Selected as part of a group by the British Council of people who, even at that young age, are already having an impact on their societies and trying to bring about change in a constructive way. I'm amazed, actually, that a British institution could have such an imaginative program, and I'm very favorably surprised to learn about it. But I also was very impressed when I talked with Faris, who took the initiative of getting in touch with me to speak to me.
Same with me. He emailed me before that.
To speak about the panel beforehand. So I was really disappointed when I got the email yesterday saying that because of this strike in Lufthansa, he's not going to be here in time. And then this morning I received his remarks through a friend. And they are quite short, and I think it's good if we hear them. So I'm going to read them out. This is what he would have said. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is an absolute honor to stand before you and share this very unique experience in which I get to tie together both my backgrounds, as you can imagine. Faris, I should explain, is half Irish and half Libyan. It's not as you can imagine, it's not something that I get to do often. Having lived on both sides of the Mediterranean, in sunny Libya as well as not so sunny Ireland, I have a first-hand account of the isolation that youth in both societies experience, an isolation that has only grown more pronounced over the past few years. Growing up in Libya, it was always very apparent that Libyans had quite a poor understanding of their northerly neighbours, though by no means out of a lack of interest. They were always eager to ask questions and listen, but due to the failure or even negligence of the Gaddafi regime to establish social ties with Europe. However, this is by no stretch of the imagination a one-sided problem. From my personal experience, the majority of European youth are also quite distant and unaware of what's on the south of the Mediterranean. Numerous times have I been asked, do I speak Libyan? And once or twice I've even been asked, do I speak hieroglyphics? This ignorance, coupled with the exaggerated image portrayed by the media of Arabs as extremist and intolerant and even terrorists, makes for a nasty combination. The already weak social ties between youth on the north and south of the Mediterranean are facing even more difficulties with the rise of radical Islamism across the north of the Mediterranean post-Arab Spring. This movement is deeply anti-West and fosters an increased distance between youth from across the Mediterranean. However, this movement is particularly attractive to youth as it promises them the mirage of a Sharia utopia in which all is ruled under God's law and no problems are imaginable. The effects of this movement on youth is present in the increase of girls wearing the niqab, the face-covering veil, the outburst of anti-Western conspiracy theories. One of my favourites was that Al Jazeera is controlled by the West and is anti-Arab and anti-Muslim, and the acts of intolerance against the West. One of the most quintessential events of this movement was when my Arab Spring euphoria collapsed in a single moment. Every morning on my drive to school in Benghazi, we would pass the World War II graves that fashioned a massive crucifix at the very top, which was always visible from the road. With the absence of churches and synagogues in Benghazi, this crucifix was really something. To me, it represented tolerance, diversity, and indeed acceptance, something which resonated with my experiences with the Libyan people. Last March, a group of young Libyan Islamists desecrated the graves, referring to them as the graves of dogs and Jews, destroying a total of 200 of the Christian headstones. The grand crucifix was then hammered and dragged to the ground, no longer to be seen. I believe that in order to combat this problem and strengthen ties between the youth on both sides, we must deal with the problem at its source. We must treat the cause and not the symptom. For the youth in the north, we must provide a better and more realistic image of their neighbours through popular media outlets, as well as social media, and of course through education. The benefits of exchange programmes and cultural excursion are immeasurable. The British Council, which the Global Changemakers Network is a part of, is very active in this regard, and I would like to see more countries do the same. For the South, however, we must counteract the radical Islamist movement by engaging with the youth through establishing alternative youth-led organisations. Such organisations would provide a platform for youth to work and cooperate on addressing issues from unemployment to education. By building on these grounds, we also offer a common ground to connect youth on both sides by showing them that there is more that connects us than there is that divides us. Global Changemakers is a brilliant example of how bridges between both sides of the Mediterranean can be built. Through their funding and support of various groups of activists from both sides, they are building a platform for youth to work on. I attended the Global Youth Summit last year, and got to meet people from different backgrounds, different cultures, and different religions. Interacting and cooperating with people who may seem very different to you is the most effective way to emphasize your similarities and build a foundation for an enduring relationship. Global Changemakers does just that. It creates enduring relationships between youth, societies, and countries. So, with an already shaky foundation and the rise of threats to the social ties between youth from both sides of the Mediterranean, from the misrepresentation by the media to the rise of radical Islamism, we are faced with a problem that we must be quick to fix before it becomes worse. And the question that I would like to ask you, the audience, and my fellow panelists, what is it that we as youth can individually do to strengthen the ties between youth on the north and south of the Mediterranean? I think that's a really excellent short presentation. And I think he really has put his finger on a very, very important question. And there's just one thing wrong with this panel, which I'm sure many of you have noticed already. We are all of one gender. And I think given especially the topic that we're discussing, that is a problem, because I think we've all seen what an important role women have played in the changes in the Mediterranean, in many of these Arab uprisings or revolutions or whatever you prefer to call them. I think also we all know that many women are worried about what the outcome of these changes will be for them, whether their contribution will be recognized, whether their social role will be enhanced, or whether they may not even be pushed back in some respects. Of course, there are many different views about what constitutes progress in this respect as in others, and I don't want to impose a specific European notion of progress on other people, but it is something that I hear women, colleagues and friends on the other side of the Mediterranean discussing from many different points of view. So in throwing this open to the floor and encouraging you to make comments and questions, I rather hope that the first speaker might be somebody of the other gender. Yes, I see a hand already. Good.
Thank you, sir. So I have a little bit comment.
Maybe you could identify yourselves.
Okay, I just wanted to manage better the time because I already had a question in previous. So I come from Albania. I have a question. Assalamu alaikum, Mohammed. So we were talking about business ethic of Vodafone. So by the way, this is what you mentioned as a story. This has become like business ethic Harvard case to all business schools. The case of Vodafone, how they allow to deliver messages. But my comment or my suggestion is that when the things get well, you can send an email to the CEO of Vodafone and say, at least for 1 week, you are, punished to give free contacts, or at least nowadays that you are having a very bad time, people, they can talk freely. And wearing the shoes of a company, they didn't have any, let me say, any legitimate contract that the state can intervene. And they did not foresee the case that, would go that far with a war in your country. So that's. Let
me clarify a little bit. Vodafone case was in Egypt.
No, I understand. I know, but just the same is applies for the poverty, and they're already having this Arab hot days. And regarding yani benim arkadaşım Türkiye'den, the question is that I know that people, the government, the Turkish government wants to join the EU, but I have a feeling talking to Turkish people that the people saying, no, we have very, very good growth, For example, if Holland has 1% annual growth, we are doing much better. So why we need EU? So are you aware of this? What people perceive and what government does?
Thank you. Well, as we have a fairly limited time, I think I will take 2 or 3 questions or interventions from the floor and then ask the panel to respond. So is anybody else? Yes, over there.
Oops, sorry. Hi, my name's Anna England Cohen. I've been working in the Middle East in Qatar for the past 9 months. My question to the panel, and just generally, would be how stringent is going to be the precondition that these states, when they emerge in whatever new form they come out of these revolutions from, how stringent are we going to demand that they be secular democracies? And how will Europe engage with them if indeed they are not secular democracies? And how that plays into either legitimising democracy for the people in these states, because we've, as has already been mentioned, we've largely ignored them thus far, and how this kind of ties into the issue that's also been mentioned as far as women's rights is concerned and other issues in this vein.
Thank you. One more? Okay, well, let's take those two. And do you want to start, Mohammed?
I had actually, I thought we were going to have another second round of comments.
Well,
so.
I did think of that, but then I always thought, well, maybe it's time to bring the floor.
Yeah,
but please also
absolutely.
comment on the other panelists.
Yeah, sure. I have postponed talking about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict because this is an important issue for most Arabs and Muslims, and it's being treated unfairly from the West generally, US and the EU, both. And I was in panel with Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State in Washington, in last October, and when the question came about supporting freedoms and supporting movements in the Middle East, and then I asked her about the Palestinians if they have peaceful protests against Israel, just to have a state. And the entire panel shrank, like, what's this guy talking about, and why this extremist Syrian became. And in general, you cannot really solve the problem in the area without solving the problem with the Palestinian-Israeli issue. And this became a very general knowledge of everybody. And I'm glad to hear that everybody agrees on the two-state solution, including President Obama. But when it's come to practice, to practical, concrete steps, nothing happening. The settlements keep growing and growing, more Palestinians becoming refugees inside their countries, internally displaced, and more people being killed from both sides. And that's the unfortunate thing. You push people toward violence from both sides. And if I want to pick up in a few remarks that my colleagues did, it's not Bush democracy in Iraq. Bush went to Iraq for weapons of mass destruction and for other things, but when he found nothing, he came up with promoting democracy, and he did very bad thing for democracy. I remember in Syria those days, 2003, 2004, the civil society was very vital, and we were very engaged with people, and everybody is happy and trying to help and support our movement. But when the Iraq war started and Iran and Syria contributed to the violence in 2005 and 2006 to make the failure case for the US, and those refugees came, 1.5 million Iraqi refugees came to Syria and started telling these terrible stories about killing them, bombing their places, sectarian violence, targeting Christians or Kurds or other minorities, people just scared. They don't want to go on this path in any way. And the government overused this. Anytime you talk about freedom of expression or human rights, you want to be like Iraq? You want to be in a civil war like Iraq? And President Bush, per se, did a terrible job in lots of things. In 2006, I went to prison with 14 leaders, in quotes, from the civil society in Syria. And every weekend, President Bush go on TV and name us one by one. And every time I'm like, is this guy making a favor for us when he naming us? We're in prison and he's calling for our release? No, he's making the case even worse because the government in Syria tried to engage with the civil society. See, they were agents. They work for the West. We told you. Now he's defending them. Look at what he's saying in media. So it's very complicated. That's damn if you do and then damn if you don't. Like, you cannot look at the government killing its people because it's interior issue and don't react. And you cannot really heavily engage in this thing. And then you get accused, like Elish said, by changing the regime, because I don't think that the NATO or the international community overused or misused the Security Council Resolution 1973. It was to protect civilians and use all necessary measures. And all necessary measures mean airstrike and protecting them from any kind of, when they impose airstrike and Gaddafi start using tanks, you have to attack those tanks. And the bad thing, you have this notion between scholars and intellectual in Middle East about what's happened in Libya, and some nationalists in Jordan or in Lebanon, they call the Libyans the NATO revolutionists, which is a very bad thing, because should we accept the idea that Benghazi could have been wiped down, 1 million human being killed, just to accept the idea that those people are nationalists and they care about their country? They have to reject the West intervention? No, they have to call for it. And about shifting the peaceful revolution in Syria to an armed conflict, the international community is responsible for this, because of lack of leadership in President Obama and in the West, most of the West. And you said a nice word. I'm sorry, I'm in Europe, I'm saying this. You said that the role of the EU was very limited, if they have any. And the EU has nothing here. It's all the US. When the US led Odessa Dawn operation, they started the operation in Libya. And now when the US doesn't want to intervene in Syria because of the election, because of the financial crisis, because of the complication of the case in Syria, the EU is not doing anything. And the EU is holding Turkey, not supporting Turkey when Turkey want to defend their flight, when their flight was down by the Syrian army. The EU issued a statement asking Turkey for a reasonable reaction, which is very crazy to imagine. The chart of the NATO allow you to have military interaction or reaction if any one of the NATO countries got attacked, and now you're asking Turkey not to react for Syria because the EU doesn't want to intervene, because the US is not backing them up on this. And here I want to get back to the student exchange program, because first touched on this and you touched on this as well. This is not enough. This is not engaging civil society. If you have selective people, highly educated, speak English, have access to knowledge, mainly have relatives out of the country, and bring them to Europe or send some people from Europe to be in touch with them, this is not engaging Middle East, not engaging Arab, and not engaging Muslims. You have to go to the rural areas and see how people live and how they think about you. And your image in their eyes is not nice, let me tell you this. It's not nice at all. They think of, and here's again the great remarks, and I couldn't imagine, he's 18 years old. He did great remarks here about the jihadist or the Islamist who is pushing for, and here's, I'm answering your question about the secular government, if we should deal with those or not. To me, I think we have to go through this tunnel from dictatorship to liberalism or to freedom. We're going through the tunnel of Islamists or Muslims, or not per se extremists, but Islamists, not necessarily using violence. And let me tell you, not always the election bring the best for the nation. Sometimes you do fair election and to bring Hamas. And the US and the EU did a terrible job by boycotting Hamas, not accepting the election result. It was monitored by the UN, it was monitored by the media, it was fair and square election. And everybody disagreed with them because they brought Hamas. People did not fall in love with Hamas, but Fatah was corrupted, very corrupted. And when you talk about Islamist leader here, the first thing comes to people's mind, oh God, he follows God's rule. He's honest, there's no corruption, he's gonna be fair with everybody, so let me elect him. And the best thing to let them elect those people and try them in power. I'll be more than happy to see Morsi falling after 5 years, and I'm expecting this. I'm very almost certain of it. That's going to happen, because I heard his speech in Laylat al-Qadr. It's the 27th of Ramadan. It was like a Friday prayer imam who's speaking, not a president. And this guy going to fail because there's lots of challenges that's bigger than him. Egypt is a huge nation, high poverty rate, 82 millions. And it's very complicated, and he's not going to be able to manage it this way. And then we get rid out of those people, the Islamists. I'm not against them if they came in election and they won. And here's the EU role here. Should we engage those or wait till the liberals won in Libya in the election and then we engage them? No, we have to engage them all because people elected them. The only case we shouldn't do is if the election is not fair and it's fraud election. And hello, they engaged with Mubarak after a terrible election in 2010 and 11. And Vice President in the US, John Biden, they asked him in the 4th day of the uprising in Egypt, what do you think of Mubarak? Is he a dictator? He said he's ally of the US. And those governments had no shame to work with those Middle East governments. And that's brought us here to this level. Now Islamists using this notion, they don't follow God's rule. And that's why they're bad. They treated us bad. So elect us. We will be doing better job by following God's rule. And let's elect them and have the people electing them. And here I want to touch on a very interesting point where people think the revolution got hijacked by the Islamists. The great people, the liberals, the people we trained in our exchange program in NDI and Freedom House, they did the revolution in their Twitter and Facebook accounts, and then the Islamists came. Yes, the election base is different from the revolutionary base. You'll find liberals, you'll find human rights fighters in the revolution core groups, but when it comes to election, everybody gonna vote. And this everybody includes minorities, includes majority, includes rural areas, people who doesn't know how to read or write. And they show them the picture of the candidate only so they can recognize him. One final remark is about the result in the election in Egypt. To see Shafiq, who is the former prime minister of Mubarak, getting almost 49% of the votes, almost the half of the nation. Not because the people corrupted in Egypt and they don't like change, because they're terrified of Morsi. They don't want to see the Muslim Brotherhood in charge. Because the Muslim Brotherhood is not doing a good job telling people about their programs. And see what they're doing in Tunisia. They're not doing a good thing. They're using the Salafists. They armed them, and they unleashed them to attack intellectuals and public events, and then they control them back. But we have to go through this. There's no way to precede this, or just, otherwise we're going to arrest those people, put them in prison, and we did nothing in the change here. I'll stop here and...
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
I would just like to follow up on the question of the resolution for Libya. The resolution indeed said that the aim of the intervention was to stop attacks against civilian population, but it didn't differentiate between civilian population on the side of the rebels and civilian population on the side of Gaddafi. So when the missiles started falling from the rebels on Tripoli, you didn't see engaging of NATO airplanes against the rebels. This is what I'm trying to say, that it was one-sidedly supporting, the intervention was supporting NATO, and in this sense the right to protect notion was misused by the international community. Regarding whether we should accept the new Muslim Islamic states that maybe come out of the revolutions, the United States said by its highest representatives that they will, and it was echoed by the European Union. Having this in mind, women's rights are universal rights, so I think the European Union and the US should stand firm in the process of transition and in the final outcome of this transition, that women's rights in those countries are respected.
Thank you. Adam.
First of all, I want to say merhaba to you. As you know, Turkey's story with EU started very early. The first negotiations started in 1963, and it's a very long time. And for Turkey, being a member of EU has meant that westernization, and so which is the most important parts of Turkey's targets. Starting from 1960s until 2000, by the beginning of 2000, people of Turkey, very huge people, nearly 80% of the Turkish citizens would love to be a member of EU. But after you may say that we are emotional people, you know, we are very emotional Mediterranean people, and people after the accession of Romania or Bulgaria think that, oh, our economy is better than our. The other things our universities are better, some of like this, and why they are the EU member and we are not. But as you know, being emotional makes you lose some details, which is the very important detail, I think, and a very big detail that Turkish population is over 70 million. That means if Turkey would become a member of EU, it means that Turkey is one of the most powerful actor of EU. And I would like to ask a question. If EU is ready for Turkey, and if EU is know about Turkey enough. We know EU, I believe that we know EU better than EU countries because Westernization project is very important for Turkey. It starts from 19th century in the last era of the Ottoman Empire, and in the first years of the new republic led by Kemal Atatürk, Westernization was the biggest and most important project of Turkey, because when we became Western country, that means that bad history with the emperor times, bad history will be erased. But it was a kind of nationalistic strategy, but it comes today. And today, by the beginning of 2000, things are changed, as I said before. Now, in Turkey, I think under 50% of people just want to want Turkey be member of EU. And so also ruling party's role is important in this session, and also our main subject, Arab Spring, is very important in the subject, because Turkey tried to become the leader of the continent and trying the more active role. As you know, in Turkey, Turkey's foreign policy was very balanced policy. 3-4 years ago, we could sit at the same table with Israelis and Syrians. Today, Israel is our enemy. Syria is Assad's. Syria is also our enemy, and we are not balanced foreign policy. And like this, and Turkey becoming a different country, comparing with the 1920s or even before Turkey in 2000. I don't know. Things are changing in Turkey, in the continent also, and I think EU will be or Westernization will be the target of Turkey. Will still going on this situation, but I think we are in the very nice time. Also, there are lots of blood in the continent, but we can see the region better with this situation, because everything is going to change. It will be better, I think, but Turkish economy and Turkish accession will be a big problem for us. And now there are a psychological thing that Turkish people are likely opposed to Europe, because they think that our country is strong in Middle East, but Turkey is stronger or not, we'll see in the future and near future, I think, by balancing policy damaged. And for my opinion, in Middle East, if you don't balance, you can't survive. For my opinion. And for Anna's question for the secular democracy, I think that everything depends on Islam, because there are different sects of Islam, Sunni Islam and Iranian style of Islam. There are different, and being a democratic, as I said before, is not just voting. And we saw that after voting, Islamic parties came into rule, and we could think that meaning of democracy will change. Democracy will not be something about casting votes from now on. And it is time to see democracy from the other side. That means, what about categorical inequalities, such as gender, such as cultural differences, such as different languages? Are these inequalities will be reflected in public policies, or are these inequalities will be political protection of individual demands of governmental mechanisms? And it depends on this, and rulers of Middle East act as an Islamist party. They are Islamist, but non-materialist Islamist parties. It will crash everything, I think. It is time to materialize and see the materialized face of Islam, because everything, I think, depends on this. Also, the Arab Spring, I think, will change the meaning of nationalism. It is, if I could give an example from Turkey, Kurdish issue is a big issue. It's also a long time, and it's like a labyrinth for Turkey. And of course, Arab Spring affected the Kurdish issue. And Turkish nationalism, I think, will from now on will reshape itself. And I think Turkey will search to move towards wider points of unification rather than just towards ethnicity. Because with the Kurdish issue, we saw that we just find the way of ethnicity for the nationalism. From now on, I think we need to find a way to wider points of unification rather than ethnicity.
Thank you. Andre, I think we were supposed to finish at 6:45, right? But we started a bit late. Can we continue for a bit longer? I know Mohammed wants to comment on the last remark, but let me take one or two more from the floor first. Yes, you.
Hello, my name is Jasna Pangihar. I have a question, since you just touched upon the Kurdish issue. I would like to hear your opinion on what the situation in Syria now and the increasingly autonomous Kurdish region in the north mean for Turkey, considering the Kurdish population in Iraq and now Syria, and the particular geographic locations where they are. What do you think this means for Turkey and its stance to this?
And you, sir.
Hello again. My name is Mehtab Singh and I'm from India, but I do live in Kran now, in Slovenia. Dobar dan. I am fortunate not to believe that the government runs the country. I would just like to refer some of the Libyan issues which I would like to raise, because I think that the people in the audiences are the future of the world. And I would just, after 11 days, when the Libyan forces actually opened fire on the revolutionaries, so after 11 days, the UN put the sanction on Libya, seizing the funds of Gaddafi. I mean, to travel to the United States, to the Security Council, if you have to make such a hard decision, it takes 1 day. And if we exclude that 1 day, we only have 10 days. Isn't that quickness a bit suspicious? Yes. On the other side, why wasn't other means applied, just like having a negotiation with Gaddafi, in terms of the warnings, You can have the lighter warnings and, of course, the diplomatic resolve here where the diplomacy actually plays an important role of diplomacy again. And I mean, the same things have been happening around the world. If we talk about a very, okay, I come from India, and to put the best side is, I mean, if I would be fair to the Indian running of the government, I mean, of course, the government running the Indian continent. The same things have been happening in India since past 50 years, from the time we gained independence from the British. The Indian government has been killing the people in Kashmir, in Punjab, and Nagaland. Why aren't those sections actually traveling to India? And apart from that, on the other side, in 2007, is the worldwide known fact that Gaddafi giving Sarkozy £42 million, and that same Sarkozy actually bombing Tripoli, and to get him out. And who gave the NATO forces right to kill Gaddafi, as Mr. Putin says? Thank you.
Should we start?
I think this is the last chance. If there's any other question, yes. Please.
Thank you. My name is Masha. I have just one short question, and if you could clarify on the role of Iran and the Arab states, and what do you think it's the perception of the Arab people on Iran, and especially now with the non-aligned summit in Tehran? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I will start with the Libya thing, because I did a paper on responsibility to protect to my recent class in public policy. And I met with Rasmussen and the head of the Libya mission, the Little General Charles, I don't recall the full name. We were together in Halifax International Security Forum when the operation was running. And I stand in front of everybody and accused him for going beyond the UN mandate in bombing, especially when they targeted Bab al-Aziziyah, which is a place where Gaddafi used to live. Because the UN mandate in the resolution saying protect civilians but not attacking Gaddafi. And that was a question mark. And I met with lots of diplomats, including some high-rank officials in France from the former government, who told me, hey, we were running a ground operation, our helicopters were this level, and we went way beyond our resolution gave us authority. And that's why when Russia and China saying veto for Syria, similar thing, we understand where they're coming from. So I carried this comment, I throw it to the head of the mission of the NATO in front of everybody publicly. So his answer, which has convinced me, was, I'm the head of the NATO mission, and I belong to the NATO headquarters with the UN Security Council resolution. I am not responsible what those individual countries and politicians come from their own countries and nation talking in the media, because my mission was to protect civilians and not to follow what politicians saying in Paris or in London or in Germany. Back to your comment, why it was 10 days and quick, because of Gaddafi's speech. He had terrifying speech. I'm going to wipe them down. I'm going to kill everybody between 14 and 60. I'm going to hang them down like rats. And he deployed 40,000 troops with tanks to go to Benghazi. And we're all agreeing here he was a crazy guy. So negotiating with a crazy guy, with all my respect to diplomacy, that's not a smart idea. And he had no friends, neither in the Arab League nor in the international community who stands for him, which is the case for Syria now. Iran, China, and Russia standing for them. And Assad has been very smart in this. He's killing people, but every day he's announcing reforms. I want to talk to them, but they're armed. I want to do reform, but they're preventing me. But Gaddafi was very clear. And you have Libya between two countries, Egypt and Tunisia, where two revolutions just won. And he's not going to let the both countries to stabilize and move on, because he want to make them very bad examples for any uprising, to teach the Libyan lesson, hey, we're not going to do a better job if you protest against me or anything. So it was very legitimate to act quickly. And let me criticize this notion of like, hey, you reacted very quickly in Libya and you were very slow in Syria and you never comment in Bahrain. If the UN did bad things in Syria and Bahrain, we shouldn't criticize them for doing a good thing in Libya. We should encourage them to follow the Libya style. Not to, there's selectivity in the Security Council. The US vetoed every single resolution toward the Palestinian state. They suspended the fund for the UNESCO because they said Jerusalem is not the Jewish state capital and it's not Israeli, it's for both countries. The US doing the same. There's double standards, and welcome to the real world. That's true. But protecting 500,000 to 1 million human beings from being massacred and wiped down, it's a great thing. I salute the NATO and the UN for. Okay, and let me get back to my colleague remark here. I agree with you when the rebels did violations, the NATO did not really protect them. And I asked the same question. I'm like, were you in charge of the rebels in the ground? Why the NATO disagreed to arm those people? Because they're Islamists? And he said no, because they're not accountable to us. We cannot control them. We cannot control their actions if they start abuse people, and they did. So basically the mission of the NATO was to destroy all the big heavy machines, tanks, flights, or anything from this. But in the ground operation, it was kind of impossible to control. I'm not defending the NATO here. They have their people to defend them, but I'm very supportive of the operation happened in Libya. And I wish the international community and the NATO intervened earlier before Srebrenica happened in Bosnia case, and they do quickly in Syria before we lose more human beings, and in elsewhere where we really have the international community has a clear responsibility to protect civilians. It's no longer acceptable, the notion, it's my country, I kill my own people, it's not your business. We're in 2012. It's everybody's business when there's people being killed. And the same case in India and different countries. There's lots of people, minorities, the Burma thing, it's been going on, Myanmar or Burma. And Human Rights Watch accused the government of doing nothing to protect the Muslim minorities there. There's always this happening, but never happened intentionally from the government to wipe down people in this way. And what's happening this way, it's getting collective reaction from the international community. Back to Iran role. Iran has been supporting the Syrian government clearly with arms and with technology. And they deployed the chief police office in Tehran to Damascus to put the map, to divide the capital in order to prevent any Tahrir-like gathering, like the Tahrir Square in Egypt, in Syria. And that was very clear in the emails the Guardian published from Assad email, that leaked emails. And furthermore, Iran supplying arms and money and involved with several operations in the ground in Syria. There's lots of allegation about snipers from Iran or about fighters. I don't buy them. Neither Hezbollah in the ground. I'm almost certain of this. They're sending technology. Iran has drone flights, and they've been used for the Syrian government. They film the areas, and then they give the information for the Syrian government. And yesterday in the summit, it was funny actually, and this responds to the previous panel when our fellow said that technology is not making people's life better or not. People using the internet to follow what's happening in the life and the real life. When the interpreter in Iran started interpreting the Egyptian president, Mohamed Morsi's speech, he said something very good about Syria. The regime is going to fall and people are facing massacres. And the interpreter was saying Bahrain is a vital case. We should stand for the Bahrainis and the Bahrain government. And he did that on purpose. And that reminds me of the case when the peace negotiation between the Israelis and Palestinians were taking place in the White House. And this Egyptian governmental state-run newspaper brought a picture of President Obama, and behind him, King Abdullah II of Jordan, Hosni Mubarak, Netanyahu, and Mahmoud Abbas. And they brought Mubarak, put him in the first one, and put Obama behind him. And they published that in the first page of the newspaper in Egypt. And a blogger catch the original picture from AP, or from the website of Associated Press, and he did a blog post, and the BBC picked the blog post, and they made the huge scandal of the Egyptian government. So Iran clearly now taking stand, trying to ally the Arabs and Muslims behind them in order to protect their nuclear program, not for Syria, not for anyone. And he's led me to react to your comment about the Islam is Sunni or Shia. It's regardless. Sorry, if it's Sunni or Shia. I think Iran using every single possible way to be a regional power. And to be part of this, you have to mobilize the people in Bahrain and tell them, hey, you're Shia, we're going to support you. And you have to mobilize the Shia in Saudi Arabia and try to encourage them to protest against the government. You have to arm Hezbollah and every single group. Iran has leveraged the Houthis in South Yemen as well. Iran did a bad job with them. Versus Saudi Arabia doing the same. And the bad thing, Turkey jumping next to Saudi Arabia, because Turkey consider themselves are Sunnis, and they consider themselves are terrified by Iran. And when Turkey tried to to balance the weight of Iran versus Saudi Arabia. But when that's done, Saudi Arabia and Turkey competing, who's the head of the Muslims here? And Saudi Arabia, of course, they had Mecca and they have the place where the Prophet Muhammad came from. So it's very hard to Turkey to compete here. But that's led the entire country to very bad situation. Every time one of those countries can shovel all these cards and throw it in the place, and we have a regional chaos where Iraq involved, Lebanon involved, and that's the bad thing about Syria when the UN doesn't react quickly. Libya is like Vegas. You know what they said about Vegas? What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. So what happens in Libya stays in Libya. But what happens in but what happened in Syria, go to Lebanon, and go to Iraq, and go to Jordan, and go to Turkey, to the BKK thing. The Syrian government brought the BKK guys. Those people were favored by the government in the 90s when Öcalan used to be based in Syria. I'll let you comment on this more, but I'll give a brief line on it. And Öcalan was asked to leave the country, and the BKK was prohibited. All the members were arrested and put in prison. And they shifted the party from BKK to PAYD. It's the exact same thing with different name. Just try to avoid the Syrian government tightness and the BKK. And the PAYD faced very brutal military course, everything from the Syrian government, more than any Kurdish political party. Now when the thing started, the revolution, and Turkey has this position, the government of Syria called the BKK people again, armed them, and give them the northeast area to scare Turkey first. In case Turkey starts to do any safe zone inside the Syrian territory, the Kurds BKK will fight against Turkey, so we don't have to use the Syrian army against Turkey per se. And to scare the nation in Syria. They're going to divide the country. See, the Kurds, they already got their own state. And now the Druze, they're getting their own state in the south, and the Alawite getting their own state in the coast, and the Christian will be forced to migrate to Europe or to scare the nation in Syria, and that's the impact more. Now Turkey know that BKK in Syria are very limited, and there's no way to have a Kurdish state. When the greatest chance was for the Kurds was Iraq war. They had the maximum thing they can reach is the local government and local parliament in the entire Iraq state. So, and I always chat with my extremist Kurdish friends who like Kurdistan, and this is not Syria, this is the west of Kurdistan. And when we come to a realistic point, they tell me, hey, there's 4 countries, Iran, Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. It's impossible to have a Kurdish state. So I'm not scared of it at all. I'm scared how the Kurdish people treating the other Kurds, because the PAYD and the PKK fighters attacking the other Kurds who's protesting against the Syrian government. So that's like pro-government thugs, but from the Kurds community, because if you bring Arab to attack the Kurds, the entire will be united against the Syrian government. So the Syrian government very smart to bring Kurds to attack the Kurds, so they don't incite the strifes of nationalism among the Kurds community. One final comment, I promise I'm not going to speak anymore, about Turkey foreign policy. Turkey had this great zero tension with neighbor policy, and they were very proud of it. And then when the Arab uprising came, everything just collapsed at once. They tried to avoid intervene in Egypt and Tunisia. It was quick case, no really high death of tool death. But when it comes to Libya, Turkey opposed the NATO thing, and then they involved with the operation to rescue the 400 wounded member of Benghazi. And as a part of the NATO, they had to be in charge, and somehow, yeah, they did not really send any flight. But when it comes to Syria, Erdogan was very aggressive to say what's happening in Syria is a Turkish local issue, domestic issue, not only Syrian issue. And we're not going to watch Assad the son doing the same his father did in Hama, wipe down the city. Nobody reacted. We're going to react quickly, and we're going to do the best we can. But when the things start happening, massacre after massacre, Erdogan doing just nothing, just watching, and people start making fun of him, and he lost lots of the credibility and the image he managed to build in the eyes of the area. He did this image because he reacted very strongly against Israel when they attacked the boat for Gaza. But I met with lots of people in Turkey, high-rank people. The image, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Erdogan had a faith in Assad, that he's his friend, and he has some leverage over Assad, and he's going to use this leverage the way Saudi Arabia did with Yemen, exactly. But when he comes to Assad and asked him to stop killing the people, it turned out Assad is not his friend and he's not his guy. He's Iran's guy, and he's not going to listen to him. And he started treat him as an enemy directly. So he believed Assad for a long time, and he followed him. And when he tried to react with strong words, he thought the EU was behind him and they're going to back him up on this. But apparently the EU and the United States did not back him up. So he's in trouble now. Thank you.
So let's hear from Adam about this, both on the, well, particularly on the Kurdish issue, but generally on the Turkish.
Actually, all of them are also connected to each other. Iran, Kurdish issues, Syria, as everything. But let me start with the Kurdish issue of Turkey, and after that the Middle East Kurdish situation. Before the Arab Spring, Kurdish people in Turkey wanted their cultural rights, and some extremist people thought that some extremist Kurdish people always wanted an independent Kurdish state. But in recent times, over 2 or 3 years, they think that they need an autonomous Kurdish state and Kurdish entity, and everything will be changed in the Middle East after Kurdish entity, autonomous Kurdish entity. Because as Abdullah said, that there are Kurds in Syria, in Iraq, in Iran, and in Turkey, and they live nearly the same place in the south of Syria, in the south, north part of Syria, north part of Iraq, and in Iran they also with the same continent they live, and in Turkey, and these if Kurdish people in Turkish parts of the field would gain the autonomy, and they will think that the other parts of living, the other countries, Syria and Iraq, they can manage to have another countries or autonomous parts. And also in Iraq, there is and de facto Kurdish autonomic entity has already been established, and Barzani, the leader of them, trained the Kurds of Syria, where they live. So, Turkish soft power. What I mean, we have a very populist prime minister. They can debate with Shimon Peres, and sometimes some people think that he is a very good Muslim, and he can. I would like to add another thing for the soft power of Turkey. And Turkish soap operas are watched all over the Middle East, and with a populist leader and with the soft power, make the Turkish roles expanded. And while all of things happen, and Kurdish issue bites Turkey. So all of the things, as I said before, connected to each other, and I don't know how to understand, how to make them see in a clear way, but I think Kurdish issue one of the key elements of the next year's future of Middle East.
Thank you. Alex, do you have a last word?
Yeah, I don't want to sound as an advocate, neither for the Turks, neither for the Kurdish, neither for Iran or Bahrain, but just a few comments. At the beginning of the Arab uprisings, Iran's Ayatollah Khamenei said it's an Islamic awakening. It wasn't an Islamic awakening in the sense that people ran with billboards and place cards through the streets demanding an establishment of Islamic states. It was a clear misinterpretation of what is going on in Tunisia, Egypt, or elsewhere. Regarding the Bahrainis, I don't think it hasn't been proven till now that the Iranians have influence the opposition to start rioting. I think it was a matter of the moment as the Arab virus spread all over the region. Regarding PKK, I think yes, this year should be decisive regarding the incorporation maybe of Kurdish cultural and political rights in the new Turkey constitution. It's a matter that is ongoing in debate, and I believe that about the groups you were talking about wanting autonomy for the eastern part of Turkey. It's a minority in the Kurdish population. Of course, it's a diversified population, but as far as I know, BDP doesn't have such an agenda for the negotiations or the political process for the constitution.
Yes, that's right. And for the Kurdish issue, it seems that time has gone, and it's very late to make useful changes in Turkish new constitution, because Turkish Kurdish people, Kurdish party BDP, they're just talking about autonomy. They don't think about, and they don't ask, they don't say anything about the cultural rights. They just said that we will be autonomous, and when we look at the social researches made around among the Kurdish people in the southeastern part of Turkey, they say that 60% of Kurdish people who live in Diyarbakir or the other cities, they want their country. They want to be independent. So I think Turkey need, as I said before, need to change its nationalism to set up a new policy, establishing a Kurdish entity in Turkey's eastern part means, I think, a big problem for the region, because it will affect Syria, it will affect Iraq, it will affect Iran, and that means Iran, Russia, and the other Israel will join the game with the different approaches. Do you need anything in the newspapers about Israel's role in this Arab Spring? They follow everything. They see all changes in the region, but in these days they prefer to be silent. But the Kurdish issue will make them speak more louder.
Well, thank you all. I have not been a very good moderator. I'm afraid I was supposed to conduct exact time management, and that I haven't done. I'm also supposed to sum up the discussion and the lessons to be learned from it, and I don't think I can do that either. I think it, especially as it would keep you longer, and I think it's probably dinner time. I notice we've had a bit of a symphonie des adieux with people moving away even as we were speaking. I think that it has been a very rich discussion. I think we have talked a lot about events on the other side of the Mediterranean from here. We have not talked very much about events on this side, and we have tended to talk as if Europe means Brussels. And I don't know, I come from an eccentric island off the northwest coast of Europe, where we're never even sure whether we are European or not. But we don't have a very high opinion of Brussels. But we think that certainly Europeans exist, and they need to have ideas and they need to have policies. And actually there are other European institutions besides the European Union. The European Union has only 27 members. The Council of Europe has 47 members. And it actually deals much more with some of the issues that are thrown up by the Arab Spring about democracy and human rights and the rule of law. And it is, in its smaller, maybe less high-profile way, trying to develop more relations with people in the countries where there have been political changes, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and actually also Morocco, which we haven't mentioned at all, although it might have been interesting to do so.
Could I comment on your remarks?
Well, very quickly, because I think people are going to get impatient.
Yeah, in one line, when Turkey came up, like 50% of the Turks, they don't want EU, and they think they don't want EU. That reminds me of the question, are the Europeans want the EU? Because when the European Constitution came and vote, the Dutch and the French said no in the referendum. And here's leads me to another comment. When I was in Brussels lobbying for Syria, somebody catch me on the side. Hey, don't come to the European Parliament, the Commission. Those people are very heavy bureaucratic bodies. Go to Paris, go to London, and go to Germany, to Berlin. There they do the foreign policy of the EU. Don't care about the others. And if you want to influence the EU, influence those three capitals, and you're doing good.
I think there is a lot in that. I mean, the Commission does have quite a bit of money, but I don't think money actually is going to solve any of these problems. I think it's sometimes useful to have money to spend, but really it's a question of attitudes and policies which will change things. Anyway, thank you all for being a very patient audience. And